All right, well, I may need this extra 30 seconds, so I'm going to go ahead and start. My name is Steve Hutchinson. I'm the Director of Security Architecture for Mitsubishi Bank of Tokyo. Just a real quick little bit about myself. I am a proud Cavalier from the University of Virginia, where I studied history. Thank goodness I had a computer science minor, because that's what pays all the bills. I started out as a C++ programmer. I moved into network engineering. And in 2001, I was asked by the healthcare company I was working for if I could create the first enterprise architecture program for them, which I did. I moved from there to enterprise security architecture, which allowed me to get a job at GE, which is still the greatest job I've ever had. I got to work shoulder to shoulder with some of the smartest people in the world, people who, when you asked them to, would manipulate a conference voting system to make sure your t-shirt design won. They were also the ones that asked me to delve into identity, which I am eternally grateful for. I was also honored in 2017 when Ian Glazer asked me to be on the inaugural board for ID Pro. It was probably one of the big reasons why that same year, One World Identity named me one of the top 100 influencers in the world. And yeah, that was 6 years ago, but I'm going to put it on every damn presentation I do from the rest of my life. 3 years ago, I started at Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, which is a division of the Bank of Tokyo. They're a wonderful company who lets me go to a number of conferences. But what about any of this gives me any authority to talk about architecture, and especially to talk about criticisms of our traditional architecture programs? And it's again, 2 decades of experience, just so much experience. And all apologies to Osterwald, but these weren't all mistakes that I made. But I do feel like over a long period of time, it did give me kind of a unique perspective on things that worked and things that didn't work. We started, like a lot of other people, we started with a Zachman framework. We then moved into TOGAF. We went back to Zachman. I like putting things in little boxes. We only used it for about 6 months because it was a little bit too rigid and structured for our culture. So we started working with a company called Metagroup. They ended up getting bought by Gartner. So for the long time, we used kind of a modified version of Gartner's EA architecture model. In the later years at GE, before I left, we were working on the scaled agile framework for enterprises. And despite all the complexity that you see on the screen, I actually like this one because it was the first time that they introduced agile concepts into the architecture practice. So why am I doing this? Why am I picking up this lance and tilting at the windmills of identity? And it's because after all this time, I can see that the architecture practice has not kept up its pace with the rest of our other IT practices. We've, I think, strayed away from our goal, which was supposed to be to enable the business to achieve whatever the business goals want in a timely fashion. A lot of the adherence to very strict, rigid architecture frameworks means that architects, a lot of times, are designing architecture for other architects rather than for the business. And of course, I'm not talking about anybody in this room. I'm sure everybody's architectures are very fluid. And so we're talking about other people outside of this room. But that means I need your help. I need this message to get through. And I need you to be my Sancho Panza as my Don Quixote goes, and we all try and tear down these white towers. To do that, we're going to have to embrace a few uncomfortable truths about our architecture practice. And in the limited time that we've got today, I'm going to cover 5 of them. So let's just jump right in. Let's go after the big sacred cow of architecture, which is the future state. Architecture focuses too much on the future state. I know what you're saying. Wait, future state, that's like everything in architecture, right? You design your future state, you build your 5-year project, you move towards it, you get to the future state, and now the business, it can do anything. Architects love living in the future state, and I get it. I like the future state. It's beautiful. All the complexity in your organization is magically washed away. All of your systems are modernized. Data moves securely and efficiently to wherever it needs to go. Everybody's got the right level of access and no more. Breaches are a thing of the past. Your regulators and your auditors love you. And the business can pretty much do whatever the business wants to do. Why wouldn't you want to live there? But we don't live there. We live here. We all live in Los Angeles, but all of our IT organizations, for the most part, grew organically over a long period of time. So when we did build new systems, when we were given money and time and effort to build a new system, well, we couldn't just tear down the old system and then build the new system in its place. You have to build the new system, and then you migrate everything over towards it. So we build our new systems next to our old systems. And it's great until we realize how dangerous it is to take down one of these legacy systems. And then late in the game, you find out that there are a couple of really important business processes that have to run on that legacy system that you weren't aware of. So instead of this beautiful new future state, we end up with the IT equivalent of urban sprawl. So why does this happen? Well, it's because since there was an IT organization, since the first IT organizations were established, the business has realized that the infrastructure that they have isn't the infrastructure that they want. Worse, it's not the one that they need to achieve the business goals that they have. So we invented architecture. This is the purpose of architecture. It's supposed to define that business IT alignment gap and reduce it. The problem is there's a fatal flaw in that presumption, and that's that business goals are so much more volatile and fluid than the architecture can keep up with. Business isn't going to wait for architecture to come around. Business isn't going to wait 5 years if growth opportunities arise. And strict adherence to a rigid architecture framework means that you can't move fast enough to adapt it to the new business needs. So you end up in a weird situation where we designed this future state so it could define, IT actions that were going to guide the enterprise. And instead, the business is leading things. The business changes are forcing us to change our future state. Future state isn't influencing business decisions, it's the other way around. This brings up uncomfortable truth number 2, which is architecture principles honestly have little effect. We quickly realized that our future state wasn't going to solve everything. Architects can't be everywhere, but we're still the smartest people in the room, right? So how do we get this voluminous knowledge and important knowledge that we have down to development teams without having to go and talk to them? We're going to build architecture principles. We're going to get a nice little council of elders, or in some organizations, several councils of elders, and we're going to take all of the incredible intelligence that we have. We're going to boil it down to architecture principles that nobody can disagree with. I mean, when you read architecture principles, you don't look at them and go, well, that's wrong. Problem is, they're not always fit for every single purpose. And usually, if you're adhering to one of these methodologies, there's not a lot of wiggle room. These aren't guidelines. These are rules that development teams have to follow, or the entire IT organization is going to fall apart. And if you're not following them, well, you need to go through this whole other process to get permission not to follow them. So why are we in this situation? Well, architecture principles have always been espoused as a way to make future design changes good, but they're designed from the perspective of the architect, not necessarily from the design team or the development team or the engineering team. This means that typically these principles are designed as desired outcomes. I encourage you to go to your own organizations and read yours and see if this is true. But it doesn't mean that following these principles is going to lead you to those outcomes. In fact, sometimes following these guidelines blindly can lead you to a bad place. Like say, if you had an architecture principle that defined what AWS landing zone you were supposed to be in, do this narrow set of rules, and you found out later on that, oops, suddenly we can't do all of these business processes that we were going to do because we ended up in the wrong place. Now we've got to back everything out, which actually happened and cost us a whole lot of money. So the idea that you can just create a set of design rules from a group of isolated architects, and at the end of it, you get some sort of well-defined IT landscape is just far too simplistic of a solution. And a lot of this stuff happens because we don't communicate enough with our engineering teams. Usually architects end up being very far removed from our engineering teams. Like for example, if your organization was, say, Las Vegas, your architects would be up here at the top of the strat eating $200 steaks and drinking $40 martinis, and your engineering team is sitting down here on the outskirts trying to figure out why the Welcome to Las Vegas sign doesn't light up anymore. And lest you think this is too cutesy of a metaphor, let's go back to that framework that we saw before. And this is a real framework that people use, the one I thought was good. Here's your enterprise architect up here at the top, where they should be. At the beginning of this process, your engineering team is way down here, 3 levels down, and numerous processes afterwards. Our goal as architects should be to bring these two organizations into closer alignment. So there's a great book written by Birger Vidar, who it's called Chess and the Art of Enterprise Architecture. And in it, he says that architects need to focus on high-level stuff. They shouldn't get down in the details. And his response was great. He said, organizations don't stumble over mountains. They stumble over molehills. This is especially true in architecture. If your goal is that future state, sitting up on top of the mountain, you are laser focused on it. And as you're walking towards it, you're just ignoring all the little obstacles that are in your way in the landscape because you don't have a deep understanding of those day-to-day problems and issues. So it's important to remember that frameworks don't create architectures. People do. And those people aren't just architects. Those people should include your designers, your developers, your frontline engineering team. And it brought up the discussion about, well, what makes a good architect? And I think it's a thing that the practice is still struggling with. But I feel like it's somebody who's got a deep domain knowledge, so you can see not only all the good solutions, but you can recognize when you're moving down the path towards a bad solution. This brings up architecture, uncomfortable truth number 4. Most of our architecture diagrams are not very useful. Again, I'm not talking about anybody in this room. These are other people. We've all seen the comically complex diagram. I mean, it's a real one, but, and honestly, in our own organizations, maybe not this complex, but we've seen diagrams that are pretty complex. And a lot of it is because when architects start drawing a diagram, they want it to include everything. You start drawing and it's like, well, wait a minute. What if they ask about this ancillary system? Let me include that one too. So you end up with a diagram that tries to explain everything, and in the end doesn't explain anything to anybody. Even when you have a beautiful diagram, like the most perfect of architecture diagrams. And I'm not saying this because it's mine, but it is. This was a diagram, it's at a high level, but it was designed for a specific purpose and for a specific audience. It's also a little redacted, but the audience was senior leadership, so managing directors and C-level people. And the purpose was for someone to agree to give Hutch $3.5 million so he could build out privileged access management solution and identity governance. And it worked. Because at the level of those people, all they needed to see was, we need to understand what it is, where in our current identity strategy does it fit, what are the other systems that it's going to impact. And it makes a great backdrop when you're talking about this, again, to those senior leaders. It's also a diagram that I used to initiate the conversation with engineering teams. Was this what I used for the engineering teams when we need to get into details? No. Every one of those little boxes on there had to be blown out. I don't mean the boxes around there, each little box, and they have other boxes. And it's important to remember, as those boxes start to get more down towards the actual frontline systems, they need to be accurate. This glosses over so much of the problems with the legacy system, the complexity in a lot of the legacy code. But it solved the problem for the senior leaders to understand what it was that we were trying to do. When you're dealing with the engineering teams, we needed to take this abstraction and bring it down to something that actually worked. So what can we take from this? First of all, architects need to target an audience. You don't target a methodology. And part of that means sometimes less is more. And when I say less is more, I mean less is more on the page. You need to have, if your people walk away and they're more confused than they were before they saw your diagram, then you failed. But it also means you need to be prepared to create not a single diagram that explains everything. You need to create a plethora of diagrams for a multitude of different audiences and a multitude of different purposes. And since, again, architects tend to work in the abstract, at some point, you need to make sure there's correlation between your abstractions and what's going on in the actual systems on the bottom. The only way that this can happen is to improve our communication with our stakeholders, which is our last uncomfortable truth. Cue standard XKCD cartoon. Also, Randall Munroe, just quick fact, Randall Munroe, originally from Richmond, Virginia, a great town. The first two rows, for me, I think this is great because this helps to describe what I feel like traditional architecture's communication problem is. It's that the guy at the top is, through his experiences and through his knowledge, knows of a pitfall. And he goes and he tries to explain it to another person using his description and his language, but the person doesn't understand and tries to tell them they don't understand and tries to explain his own situation in his own words. And now the architect doesn't understand. And in the end, all three people end up in a pit. Down on the bottom, different perspective, person has the same experience, understands the same thing, goes and finds the person, but instead of just telling them what to do, he brings them along. They experience it together. Now they've got a shared experience in their own words, and now they can both go off to explain it to their different constituencies. So, take away from this, governance is good, collaboration is better. Notice I didn't say governance is bad. I mean, architecture still needs to have governance as a big component in its program. I'm not talking about upending the whole program. But our problem is we don't have collaboration. We need to get out of our isolated towers and bring in as many people as possible, because it's only when we do that, when we start to crowdsource that knowledge, that we start to hear from other constituencies that are bringing us information that we might not have. Also, to help you do this, architects really do need to be aligned to a small set of engineering teams, whatever it is within your domain, who they empower not just to get information from, but to empower them to be involved in those architecture decisions. So I've complained a lot. And one of my favorite movie lines is from a movie called As Good as It Gets. Helen Hunt, Jack Nicholson, Cuba Gooding Jr. And there's a scene where Cuba Gooding Jr. is basically telling Jack Nicholson everything he's done wrong. And Jack Nicholson finally screams at him, "I'm drowning, and you're describing the water." Architects do a lot of water describing. I don't want to do that. I want to give you a few lifelines, advice to take back to your organizations. First, make your architecture more agile. And by that, I mean, take your artifacts and run them like you would code. You know, build a backlog, prioritize the backlog, work through a couple of sprints. Open up the conversation with your technical engineering teams. I know it sounds obvious, but it doesn't happen a lot. The other piece of the agile puzzle is to start treating your architecture efforts like a product, not a project. Too many times we do that thing where we define the future state and then we build the big long project to go through it. Can't do that anymore. So you need to kind of define your as-is architecture. Again, use that backlog. And that way, when the business changes direction, or the ground shifts underneath you, or any one of 1,000 other things happen that would impact your architecture program, it's fine. Go through your backlog, figure out which things don't make sense anymore, remove them, reprioritize the list, keep going with the next sprint. Your architecture will always be valid. It's not valid some point in the future, it's valid now. Finally, bring decentralization and democratization to your architecture, not just to your architecture team, but to your entire architecture effort. Start involving those unheard constituencies. And I kept saying, sorry, designers, developers, but it also includes bringing your end users, bringing what is supposed to be the business leaders, helping to define what a lot of those things are. And that's time. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions?
Is there any other literature you recommend for someone that's saying it's tossed into an architect role deeper in the field?
That's an excellent question. There are, in researching this topic, there are a number. I should build a bibliography. Honestly, the best information is like in blogs. And stuff I have found. It's the most up-to-date. A lot of the printed documentation tends to be focused on, hey, here's how you too can become proficient in Zachman and TOGAF. And here's another thing. I don't mean to say there's nothing valuable to be gained out of Zachman and TOGAF. If you don't have an existing architecture program, those are wonderful places to start to help you understand what that means. The problem arises when Zachman and TOGAF become the goal of architecture, not the business anymore. Like, I'm going to have the most Zachman-aligned architecture. Here's another little hint. Your senior leaders don't care about how great your architecture is. They care that it's enabling them to make quick business decisions and allowing IT to respond to them.
So you showed that you used Zachman in like 2 episodes or 2 sprints or whatever time frame. What about SAFA, even more security-driven approach, which also has a nice matrix model? Is that something that came across in your work?
Not back in 2001, no. But again, insert any framework that you want. It's not that the framework is bad. It's the slavish adherence to the framework when demonstrable business goals aren't being met and still holding on to that. So it's not the framework. And I'm sorry if I made it sound like it was. But it's forgetting why you started it in the first place.
I guess the question would be, you have to choose a framework at some point that it is starting. So you have to have a way of evaluating the framework at once along the way to figure out whether this will work.
Yeah, well, honestly, that was the conversation that we had when we went through our initial rounds. But Zachman looked so good because, and things that it did do nicely were gave us guidance in how do we go out and canvas the organization to find all of the processes and systems and people and things and start to categorize them. The problem was the way that they had the governance program set up would never have worked for our little healthcare company. What did work was, and it's the reason why we partnered with Metagroup, because they were the first people that we had talked to that said, it's not about adhering to this, it's what gives you a process that you can get that business IT gap reduced. And even the Gartner EA model that we were kind of following was heavily, heavily modified to meet the needs of our organization. So I think it's fine if you do research and you find here's the one that works best with our organization at the time, but just be open and prepared to make major modifications to it to make it work in your organization and in your culture. All right. I understand I'm standing between you and 4 o'clock break, so thank you very much.